Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our March 8th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode is one that's going to be especially intriguing for those of you who raise livestock. We have renowned ag economist Dr. Jayson Lusk here to share some new research regarding consumer perceptions about real meat and plant-based imitations. And we have Mike Telford, who's the executive director of the Iowa Farm Animal Care Coalition, to talk with us about a helpful avenue that's available to Iowa consumers who have questions or concerns about farm animal care. We'll start with Dr. Jayson Lusk, who recently took time to discuss the market for plant-based imitation meat with Spokesman editor Dirk Steimel.
We're here with Jayson Lusk, Distinguished Professor and Head of the Agricultural Economics Department at Purdue University. Today we'll discuss consumer perceptions of real meat and their plant-based alternatives. Dr. Lusk, in a recent blog you discussed the findings of a consumer perception study on meat versus the plant-based alternatives. What stood out for you in that study that was done by Kansas State for the Cattlemen's Beef Promotion and Research Board?
Well, there's a lot to dig into there, so I'm not sure there's one single thing that stands out, but a lot of interesting results. If I had to pick one, it would perhaps be that, this is a little technical, but the cross-price elasticity between the plant-based alternatives and beef was much smaller than I would anticipate, meaning if Impossible Foods, for example, drops their price by 20%, which they just announced that they plan to do, the impact on beef is relatively small.
And why is that?
I think there's a couple of factors. One is that while it is the case that it's not either or, that a lot of consumers choose both a plant-based alternative and a traditional meat alternative, there are some differences in the types of people that buy the plant-based alternatives. They tend to be much more likely to be, of course, they're more likely to be vegetarians. So in that case, doesn't matter what's happening to the price of beef, it's not going to affect those people very much. But even still, there's what you might call a flexitarian, the kind of consumer that will eat meat, but is not a heavy meat, typical meat consumer. So, reducing the price of, say, Impossible or Beyond might draw those consumers into buying more of that, but those weren't people that were buying beef to begin with. So it's not hurting beef as much as you might think. The other thing maybe too is that, these substitutes at the moment are still priced at a pretty significant premium to traditional beef products. So even if you drop a 20%, let's say, it's still the case that it's still priced at a premium above beef products. So even though it's becoming more favorable in price terms, it's still not equal to beef, and as a result may be having somewhat limited impacts.
You mentioned the type of people or the type of consumers that were buying these plant-based alternatives. What are their biggest factors? What do they look for when they're choosing these products?
In terms of demographics, they don't look particularly different than your typical food consumer, other than perhaps being quite a bit younger. So these plant-based alternatives are much more attractive to, say, the under 30 crowd. The things in terms of what they're looking for out of their food, they tend to be consumers that are much more concerned about environmental issues, tend to be much more concerned about animal welfare issues. That's probably not terribly surprising. And then, from some other work we've done, tend to be consumers who are more interested in novelty, like just trying out new things.
You mentioned that Impossible Burger lowered their prices to compete better with ground beef. Are we going to see more of that in the market as these companies gear up and try to gain more market share?
I think it's inevitable that if they don't, somebody else will enter the market, and they will. So, these companies have made a lot of claims about impacts, about how they're more favorable in terms of resource use, like, say, less water, less land, less energy, that kind of thing. And if that's true, then it should be the case that in the long run they should be more affordable, right? If they're using fewer resources, sort of basic economics would suggest that they should cost less, and they're not at the moment. So I think over time, as they gain economies of scale, they'll probably move down that price point. The other factor, that suggests that would kind of counter that perhaps is catering to a particular kind of consumer. And if you can make a choice, why not go after the kind of higher end of the market, people that are willing to pay more, maybe a little higher income, and so part of it, their pricing may relate to their strategy of who they're trying to appeal to at the very beginning, and that may or may not go away. But I think just the basic economics of it are that, again, if their claims are true, and I think there's not a lot of independent verification of those at the moment, one would expect that their prices would fall.
Do you expect that more big fast food companies like Burger King and McDonald's will move into this area and offer plant-based alternatives?
Yes, I mean, we're seeing it at the moment, and we saw it's been almost a year ago now that, or maybe over a year ago, that Burger King had the big announcement where they rolled out an Impossible Burger, and they saw their sales increase, a fair amount in the wake of that. Now, again, I think they weren't necessarily substituting away from, the traditional Whopper. It was in large part bringing new people into Burger King that hadn't been there before. And so if you're a restaurant chain sitting there on the side, you see that and you think, oh, I'd like to attract a whole bunch of new people to my restaurant. And so you'll see some of that, I think, playing out. Indeed, there's been some announcements of several companies trying to roll out their versions of these burgers too. And I think so in the short run, yes, I think we'll see several introductions, several announcements along those lines. I think the real question is long term, when it's not a novelty anymore, when everybody has it, what's the share, for example? And I think that's a much more debatable kind of question.
Certainly, investment money has really flowed into these products. Do you think those investments will continue if the market share doesn't rise to certain levels?
Yeah, you're right, Dirk. Hundreds of millions of dollars have flown into this space, and it's why we're having this conversation. I mean, plant-based, burgers are not new. We've had kind of soy-based alternatives for a long time now. What's making these things new is the food science and the engineering that's made them much more similar in terms of taste and texture to beef alternatives. And part of that is because they've had investment dollars that have come in. So you're right. I mean, at the moment, even though if you look at grocery store scanner data, these products are certainly less than 1% of all fresh meat sales at the moment, far less than 1%. But they're experiencing large percentage growth, which, you can get a large percentage growth if you start from a small base. But that percentage growth is what is attracting some of those investors. And if they can keep growing at, some of those kind of astronomical percentages, they'll continue to attract some of those additional dollars. And you can see, the CEO of Impossible Food, for example, has got some pretty bold visions. I mean, he's been pretty clear. His goal is to put traditional meat out of business within the next 20 or 30 years. So if that, I think that won't happen. That extreme outcome is certainly not likely to happen. But if that's what you're pitching to investors, it's probably going to attract some dollars. I think the other thing we didn't study in this report, but is certainly in the landscape here, are the lab-based alternatives, or kind of the cellular alternatives. And that's one where, it's been slow. Investment dollars have flown in. We still don't see those products on the market yet, in part because the science is catching up, and also because they've had a hard time getting it to a cost level that's competitive. And, if you can't do that in the next 5 or 10 years, it's hard to imagine that money sticking around for a longer period of time.
I saw that the company was trying to make a ribeye steak with 3D printing.
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to try to go beyond ground products and nuggets into like more traditional type of cuts?
Oh, they're going to try. So, but you're right. Everybody's sort of entered the ground market or the processed market because that's the low hanging fruit in terms of the science. It's maybe a little easier in that regard. But yeah, it's certainly the case that there are a number of companies out there trying to replicate a steak, I still haven't seen anybody try to produce bacon. I think that can you do that? Some of the science they're getting the fat mixture right, for example, is pretty hard. It's not just growing protein muscle fibers in a proverbial petri dish. You got to get all the other things that go along with it, and that's what we really enjoy about the taste of a lot of conventional meat products is it's the right mixture about both that protein and the fat and other things too.
What do you think are the key messages that farmers and ranchers need to convey to reassure uh, consumers about their products and counteract all this publicity that the alternatives have been getting?
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to mention, particularly with regard to beef, is beef has received some negative attention over the years. But I think one way to think about it is that it's a important part of an ecosystem in many cases, and a part of the economics of keeping ranch lands viable. And I think that's one reason we're going to see beef stick around. It may not always be in the same exact form or volumes we see now, but there are a lot of lands we probably don't want to bring into crop row production. And how else are you going to manage those lands in a way that's good for the environment and good for the other animals that live there if you don't have an economic incentive to do that from things like livestock? So, I think maybe rather than trying to tear down these competitors that are there, I think focusing on the things that are good about beef products. And then back to maybe that price elasticity thing I mentioned is if you want people to buy more beef, focus on your own price, and your own quality seems to have much more impact than these kind of cross price substitution things. And so I think it does emphasize that if say beef, pork, chicken wants to continue to tell a story about sustainability, continuing to invest in innovative technologies, genetics that can continue to improve efficiencies, can both improve sustainability, but also improve that price point, which, at the moment is a much bigger driver than whatever, say, Impossible or Beyond Meat is being priced at.
And sustainability is a big issue with customers. So, do you think that's a good place to put an emphasis for farmers and ranchers?
It is. I think it's an issue that will continue to grow in importance. It's probably not an issue that's front of mind for the typical food consumer that's going to drive their choice on the margin, but it is for some. There's a maybe 10 to 20% of consumers out there that do think of that as a top priority issue. But it's becoming much more important to even the intermediaries in the food supply chain, whether it's the retailers or others that are having to keep track now of sustainability metrics. And it's probably going to matter, frankly, more in policy sorts of discussions. And so I think, whether that individual consumer, average consumer, is paying a lot of attention to it, there's a lot of other factors that are going on that I think is going to increase and elevate that role of sustainability in the food system.
And you mentioned early on that the typical alternative meat consumer was often young. Does the sustainability issue resonate with young people?
It does. I mean, I think the younger consumers tend to be more concerned about environmental outcomes. They tend to be more concerned about the animal welfare outcomes, the kind of labor issues sometimes that get brought up in agriculture. I think a question that we don't really know is, do the younger consumers hang on to those values as they get older, or do they care about different things as they mature and change, their life patterns and lifestyle? The only way we'll know that is just to live another decade or so and see what happens.
Yeah. So, in the long run, you believe that producing high quality beef, doing it sustainably, is the best way to counteract this the alternatives.
I think that's right. Continuing to invest in the science that can improve the efficiency and sustainability of beef is key because it can help improve the affordability of beef. But you can't do that and sacrifice quality. I think particularly as you think about these plant-based alternatives that could come on, and if they could get quite a bit cheaper, then how are you going to compete? And one answer to that is I'm going to compete on the quality I'm providing, and I'm going to compete on the story I'm providing about what beef does in terms of its place in an ecosystem and in an economy. And I think that's a pretty positive story that a lot of consumers are open to.
Well, this topic certainly isn't going away, but I think it's helpful to get an economic perspective on where things are headed with imitation meat and what we as livestock farmers and advocates can do to proactively position ourselves in the marketplace. We appreciate Dr. Lusk sharing his time and expertise with us, and something tells me we'll be hearing a lot more about this topic in the weeks and months to come. From imitation meat, we pivot to another topic that livestock farmers keep a close eye on: consumer perceptions about farm animal care. And here's something you may not know. There's a coalition in Iowa that's fully dedicated to responding to consumers' questions and concerns about livestock care by utilizing the animal care expertise that's available through Iowa State University and the Iowa State Veterinarian's Office. Spokesman reporter Corey Munson has the story with Iowa Farm Animal Care Coalition Executive Director Mike Telford.
Can you start out by telling us about IFAC's history and mission? How was the coalition formed, and what organizations are involved?
Iowa Farm Animal Care was originally created in 2012. It took a few years, I think, for everybody to kind of get recruited and the program started. Once again, we're primarily there for information and to assist the livestock industry from the standpoint of providing information to just the general public and consumers that would call in. And we do get quite a few calls on just questions. And I think it's one of those situations, Corey, where as time goes by, every generation is farther and farther removed from production agriculture, and we don't have access to grandpa's farm or our uncle's livestock operation. And it's just human nature that if you don't know how something operates, you tend not to trust it. And so we want to give transparency to what livestock producers actually do and how they actually do it. And 95+% of the livestock producers out there really do a great job. They're very professional, they're very successful. And so we answer those general questions, and then if there are particular concerns, then we have a process that we go through to make sure that those herds get the information and advice that they need. Of course, the vision for Iowa Farm Animal Care is that all farm animals deserve to receive, humane and proper care.
What are some of the most common questions and concerns you get via your organization's hotline?
Over the years, we've had a lot of questions about transportation of animals. And certainly, I think that, most of the questions come from consumers and the general public on the things that they can actually see. Obviously, people when they're traveling around, they'll see animals in trucks. I've had questions on how long can they be on those trucks. Lots of times folks don't realize that, for example, hogs, if they're market animals, they're not going to be in that truck very long because they're on their way to one of the packing plants. Get questions on when we do harvest animals, how do you make sure that they don't actually feel any pain? And of course, you go through some of the protocols that are in our plants today that are professionally done. In the summertime when it's really warm, do cows get hot? And I always enjoy explaining to people, especially when they're concerned about animals in Iowa, that we have places down south where it's much warmer, and certainly those cows can experience maybe heat stress for an hour or two, but the big advantage that we have in Iowa is that it cools down in the evening, and those animals can rest, relax, get plenty to eat and drink, and be ready for another warm day. But we don't have the extreme heat, nor do we have the required breeding where you're using like Brahma bulls so that they're more heat resistant. When they see pigs in a transport in the cold weather like we've had this winter, how do they make sure that those animals are not too cold? I had a lady that not long ago called me. She was really concerned about this calf that was penned in the middle of a pasture. And one of the things that I do is I tell them, can you send me or text me a picture? this lady said, yeah, I'd be very glad to. And what she sent me was the picture of a very, very expensive mobile calf feeder that was standing out in the middle of a pasture, and this calf was not confined in the feeder. It was just in there eating. But she was really concerned about this poor animal. And so that's the kind of thing that, we try to address so that people actually know, hey, this is what producers are doing. And sometimes they're fairly simple, and sometimes they're a little more complex.
What, in your experience, are some of the most common misconceptions about livestock farming that you can help address to consumers?
There's a lot of tourists that we have that come through Iowa. And one of the things that a lot of people don't understand, and it kind of caught me off guard the first 2 or 3 times I would get this call, but there's some people that just don't understand the concept of a cattle feedlot, as an example. Why are these animals standing out there? There's no grass. They're standing, in a dirty lot. Why are they there? Why are they doing that? Aren't those animals being abused? And of course, you have to explain to them that, those cattle are getting ready to be harvested, and they're in the final stage of their life cycle where obviously they're on probably a pretty good ration. We're trying to get them up to choice or prime grade, and they're only going to be in that lot for a few weeks as they approach market weight. And so that's one of the things that you run into. The other thing that we run into is what I would call hobby farmers. And typically it's a young person that says, raising cattle's got to be easy. You have a fenced pasture, you put the animal in there, it's going to eat grass, it's going to drink water, it's going to grow. And, they find out later that, those animals may need to be vaccinated. They're certainly going to need feed and water all the time. When I usually get a concern call, it's going to be somebody that's either got something going on that's affected them personally, and for that reason they can't take care of the animals, or you run into a situation where it's a hobby farmer and he's just, he or she's just in over their head.
There were a lot of challenges for livestock farmers in the last year, from processing plant closures to extreme weather conditions in February here. Do situations like this increase calls to your hotline?
Hot and cold weather, Corey, will really increase the phone calls into our program. I think the cold weather is probably much more dangerous than the hot weather. And in the last few weeks here, where we've had these extremely cold temperatures and lots of snow, there's been a lot of calls in regards to access to water and feed. And certainly we want to make sure that those animals do have that access. Typically with hot weather, the main thing is, do they have access to water and in some cases shade? I often talked about our on-farm evaluations. And we work with both the Animal Science Department and Veterinary Medicine at Iowa State. When we do have issues that we need to address, and it's a voluntary program, we will send a team out from Iowa State to visit with producers and review their operation. And I always tell the producers, when we send the team out, if they agree to have them come out and review their operation, is write down every question you've got that you would like answered about your operation, because the folks from Iowa State are true specialists. And we always send out a species specialist. So if it's poultry, we've got one of those. If it's small ruminants like sheep or goats, we've got one of those. We can certainly do cattle and hogs. But we want to make sure that they have the best management practices, and we try to do everything we can to assure that they're successful. And if there are things that they're doing wrong or just didn't comprehend, we certainly want to make sure that we don't just address that in the report, but we also put them in a situation where they've got a mentor in the industry that they can talk to, and they can go to Extension and get continuing education on how they can improve.
Well, I think it's just a fact that at some point in our lives, everybody needs a little help once in a while, and I appreciate you guys being there as that assistance for producers.
Well, that's right, Corey, we all need a little help every now and then, but I really want to urge your listeners, if they see something out there that they're concerned about, don't wait, call, because we want to make sure that the situation certainly gets better and not worse. And our website is iowafarmanimalcare.org. And once you go on there, you can read about the program. You can see all the specialists that are involved and all the advisory committee members that we work with. And the toll-free number, which rings directly to me, is 1-800-252-0577. Once again, if people see something out there that they have a question about or concerned about, please call us. That's why we're here.
You know, when Iowa Farm Bureau and the Iowa pork producers got together to create the Iowa Farm Animal Care Coalition a decade ago, the goal was to be proactive and give Iowans an outlet for their animal care questions. Farmers have such a good story to tell when it comes to animal care, and we've got so many great animal care experts across this state. So it only makes sense to connect those experts with Iowans who, as you heard Mike say, are becoming further and further removed from the farm. To learn more, you can head out to iowafarmanimalcare.org. So we've nearly reached the end of this episode, but before you go, I want to point out 2 opportunities for you in the weeks to come. The first is your chance to nominate a worthy farmer for Iowa's 2021 Conservation Farmer of the Year Award. We know there are plenty of worthy candidates out there, so now's the time to submit your nominee before you start to get busy in the fields. And to do that, click the link we've provided in the notes for this podcast episode, or head out to iowafarmbureau.com. The second opportunity is a webinar with USDA Midwest Climate Hub Director Dennis Todey on March 17th. If you'd like some expert insights into how the 2021 growing season's shaping up, register for that webinar using the link in our episode notes or visit iowafarmbureau.com. And with that, I'll wrap up this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's interviews and that you'll join us for our next regularly scheduled episode on March 22nd. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.